with you about the basics of blockchain, what's happening, how this is coming to life in business. And man, what a change it's been since 2017 at the height of the discussions, at the initial height. And now it seems to be rising even higher. So let's take a look into what's happening. This is actually a very personal topic for me because in addition to how digital transformation is happening, I want to introduce you to my father-in-law. This is my father-in-law. I call him Ba. He's a great man. He's run in the Tiong Bahru market, a store that sells fresh chicken for 70 years. And he's in his 80s now. And he just loves to do that. He loves his customers. He loves to be engaged. And of course, COVID-19 has come in and transformed business, but more importantly, has introduced a critical risk to men and women his age. If they get COVID-19, the mortality rate around the world has been lower. Of course, Singapore has been extraordinarily blessed in this area. And so now with him, for the past 70 plus years, he's been taking cash. But how do we, reduce the risk? So my wife and I worked with him and worked with Nets and the digital office here, and we were able to get a QR code on his store, and now he can receive digital payments as well. So he learned all about it and he's happy with it as well. So digital transformation has actually helped save one of my family members, continue to do what he loves, but yet in a safer way. We need to look at digital payments carefully and make sure that this is something that can go around all of Singapore. We can reach into all of the areas in the heartlands with this technology of digital currency. And blockchain is an enabler for that. And it wasn't just, us that were concerned about it from a family perspective. China took very quick steps. They said, look, areas that have been impacted in a big way by the coronavirus, let's destroy that money. We're going to have people get more into the digital use of WeChat and more. Let's make sure that the digital yuan comes into place in order to not just make things different and have a game changer. Those are exciting and we'll get into that. But right at the fundamental point was the health. So this is a critical and opportune time to look into how to make changes. And as we see also coming out of China, the numbers and the type of impact there has significantly reduced. So how does digital currency line up with blockchain? Why is blockchain important? So with any time we want to do business, we want to be able to have a very orderly flow to transactions. We'd like to recognize that a transaction occurred. We want to validate that it was a legitimate transaction. And I'm going to stop sharing here for a moment. We want to make sure that the transaction that occurs has been cleared and makes sense and is accurate. If we can avoid errors, even better, right? And we also want to avoid fraudulent transactions. And I don't mean that someone doing something bad, that's a constant fight throughout human history, but rather fraudulent where someone is actually taking a transaction and changing it mischievously in a way to create more money perhaps in the system that perhaps wasn't theirs, or perhaps to steal something out of it. And so this is where blockchain provides some interesting benefits. But let's first explain what it is. First, we want to send money between party A and B. So A says, listen, I want to make this transaction. A transaction gets put up. The transaction is then sent around to the whole network for them to validate. Then the transaction is added onto a block. When that transaction is approved and sealed, it's added into a chain, hence the word blockchain. And finally, the transaction occurs and the money moves from A to B. Now, in this case, we talked about money, but it could be any digital asset. It could be a digital asset like a movie or a music, or perhaps title to a digital house. A house that you have, a digital title rather, where you take it and say, this is on a computer system, let's make sure that this is moved from one person to another. There's some interesting challenges, though, and appropriate use cases here. First of all, blockchain is a guaranteed delivery. You want a system that's going to make sure it gets from one point to another. This is a capability blockchain has, because all those nodes in the system are available to make sure that when one puts it up, if enough are still alive, then it'll get it through. The second, in addition to guaranteed delivery, you are also able to ensure chain of custody and privacy. It's highly encrypted. The computers work together to create even harder encryption as the chain gets more and more complex. And so you can really be more assured that the incorrect party can't look into and see what happened in it. On the other hand, you can see that the correct party was the one who received it, that they were able to look and see the entire set of information that they have access to. So you've got guaranteed delivery, you have highly secure. But then because all these computers are involved, in today's world, it's more costly than if one computer, one compute power was taken care. So look at this. Guaranteed delivery, high security, but costs more. What are the types of use cases that are natural for this? Well, there's some really natural use cases like high value transactions. For example, I wanted to buy a house. And of course, the title of the house, I don't want to change, who owned the house 5 years ago? We're not going to ever change that. So blockchain allows for this to be used. It's guaranteed, it's authenticated. The bank, the lawyers, the seller, the buyer, all have consented to it. This system lends itself to that type of activity. Let's look a little bit further. If you consider what blockchain prevents too, it prevents forgery. So you can't just introduce a fake transaction. The other systems are going to say, no, this looks incorrect. It's difficult for you to change a transaction that's already been done. In fact, it's called immutable, which means that it cannot be changed. There are ways to do anything, so especially in computing, and that's normally when the whole community gets together and makes a change. So it's not completely impossible, but it's quite difficult, let's say. The third aspect is we want to make sure that you can't just duplicate transactions. Fourth, that you can't take it out of order because we do have the chain there. These are all different good, strong ways to do business, making sure that activity occurred in the right order and it was the right and accurate activity that occurred. Now, digital currency can sit on top of a system like blockchain or be part of a distributed ledger at least, where multiple parties are able to see what's happening. The digital currency part, we can see here that you have your transportation card. You have the ability here to be able to see, these are wallets that are actually in place now here in Singapore. I don't know if you use Fave. It's one of the fantastic ways to save some money, as well as change the way we make payments as we go ahead and do business. The privacy side becomes very interesting as well. If you say, well, Keith, digital, how can we make sure, normally I can just pay cash for something. No one is necessarily looking at me. Visa, if I use my Visa card, they just see how much I spent at a store. They don't necessarily see exactly what I spent at the store, etc. Whereas some of these, like if I order food on Grab, Grab gets to see exactly what I ordered. On WeChat, I scan the QR code of the items on the menu sometimes. Well, there's always these pros and cons, right? The pros are that vendors get a better sense who's buying my product, when, for what, how frequently. So I can do better inventory management, my marketing is more targeted, etc. On the other side, though, are the cons. We have the ability for people that aren't necessarily party to the transaction to see a bit more of what was being done and how things are, who's buying it, and perhaps understand even why we purchased it. At the same time, though, digital currencies allow us, and especially the central bank, to deliver on some very interesting promises that have always been around. If there were a run on a particular bank, meaning that a physical bank had a challenge where they were no longer able to provide cash, their ATMs, for example, were shut down, then with a digital wallet, everyone is able to, from a central bank, receive funds, and actually puts in place a very interesting operations model where you can ensure that the currency supply is flowing as well. And that brings us to the central bank digital currency. Before, when the digital currencies were being looked at, all is meant for people that are enthusiasts or computer people only. And now all of a sudden, you have some really tremendous change in the marketplace. China issued its central bank digital currency earlier this year. We have in retailers in Sweden are saying that by 2025, 50% of them expect to not accept cash payments. And of course, here in Singapore, you go to some retailers and they don't accept cash anymore. They're like, pay with nets, pay with something, but I'm not accepting cash because of the safety issue. So COVID-19 has probably sped up Sweden's adoption even faster, for example. And central banks around the world are beginning to say, so now I have less need for physical currency. I'm getting more digital currency here. Where should I play? Should WeChat own that space? Should the technology companies own this, or should the central banks own it? And what we did as a study in the School of Computing FinTech lab, we went and studied what are digital currencies versus fiat? How are they being used? So as we know, the reason for currency is to help facilitate a transaction between two parties without actually having the physical good. The physical good was, here's some corn and you'll give me some fish. That was the barter system. But currency is, I just take my money and now you give me fish. And that money represents some value. So any currency, whether digital, physical, what have you, needs to have a stable value for us to do business. Now, the challenge has been for blockchain and Bitcoin adoption in particular, the currency values all over the place. Is it 15,000? Yes, earlier this weekend, it jumped up from 13,000. If you had your prices for pizza in Bitcoin, the price would be all over the board, right? You wouldn't know what you're paying one day to the next. But there's something called stable coins. These are USDT, which is Tether, and others that have come in and have been able to secure their value against currencies, real currencies like the US dollars and other. We did a study at the FinTech lab, and we're able to see the G20 nations, the top 20 nations in the world, looking at their currencies and comparing it with digital cryptocurrencies, stable coins, and we found that several of the stable coins are actually more secure, meaning less volatile than some of the top 20 nations currencies in the world. That was amazing to us. And so this means that these types of cryptocurrencies are really entering the world stage in a very valid way today. They're being used, they're maintaining their value, and that allows businesses to consider doing transactions in them. And that also means it provides a good reason for the central banks, and again, I stop sharing, for the central banks to come in and to be able to set up similar digital currencies, because they're looking at it and saying, I have these physical currencies. Should it be a private company that comes in and provides it? Or should I, as a central bank that controls the monetary supply, come in and provide this instead? And so that brings us over to another aspect here. Look at this, DBS. If we were wondering, well, has cryptocurrency gone away? Is it not so important? DBS is said in the news, Business Times last week, they're going to set up a cryptocurrency exchange. And of course, the digital yuan over in China, they said, we're going to coexist with Alipay and WeChat. And in fact, last year in 2019, the central bank, the People's Bank of China, went and said to Alipay and WeChat, we have to back all of your deposits. The central bank was concerned. What happens if a private company changed their direction or went out of business? The economy would be impacted. So the central bank stepped in and decided to collaborate and work very closely with them. A third area is PayPal. A lot of us have used PayPal to transact money back and forth. It was one of those first digital internet, companies that enabled payments outside of MasterCard and Visa. 300 million users are being introduced to this back in October. Amazing how things are coming to pass now. So the pace and the speed of adoption is moving a lot faster and in a more stable way. What happened back in 2017 when I used to ask people, do you have a cryptocurrency wallet? Everyone in the room would raise their hand. Even if they didn't have one, they were like, I can't be left out. I have one too. But then we saw lots of different projects come out and challenge in things that didn't really make sense in how you were going to use blockchain. It's not necessarily the fastest protocol, but it's very secure. It's not necessarily the cheapest, but it's also guaranteed delivery. So the use cases needed to be a bit more careful. And so we opened up something called the Crystal Center, a lab at the School of Computing, in 2017 and going into 18, to ask very more principled questions. And LongHash Ventures came along also to look and see what are the projects that could really be useful, really deliver game-changing, in the marketplace to people's lives and more. And so I'm joined here by Shakai. He's here to share a perspective about what's happening in this digital currency space, what's happening with blockchain, how there's adoption going along. And he's eminently qualified to do so. He's been a consultant at McKinsey. He's done digital transformation across Southeast Asia, in particular in financial services, and importantly, in telecommunications. And so if we could open up the video, Shakai, to you as well. Shakai, welcome. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Prof. Carter. And that was a super insightful presentation. I'd like to take it from there. So we at LongHash Ventures, we support early stage blockchain startups by giving them investment or bringing them through our accelerator program. So today I'd like to share a little bit more about where we are in terms of the startup space for blockchain companies. So if I may invite Prof. Carter to bring up the slide as well. Many of you may be thinking, okay, people have been talking about blockchain for many years now. Bitcoin was invented more than 10 years ago, but where is blockchain today? What are the companies doing? What are the startups doing? And here I'd like to invite you to recall the cycle of the internet. The internet was actually invented more than a few decades, many decades ago in 1980s, but it really wasn't until the late 1990s or close to the 2000s, where some of you may remember the dot-com bubble, where there was such a huge hype where everybody started starting these dot-com companies and everybody started funding these dot-com companies. And that led to, of course, the bubble in the year 2000. And then subsequently, the hype died down. But that doesn't mean that there weren't any legitimate use cases. That doesn't also mean that there wasn't any long-term disruptive potential. In fact, the hype actually brought in the talent, capital, and interest that laid the foundation for the future liftoff of all the internet companies you see today. So when PayPal was first founded back in the 1990s as well, they struggled to find their product market fit. But eventually, they found their first set of users, the people who wanted to then use kind of like the digital options, and therefore they needed some ways to do payment. Facebook also came around in the early 2000s. Google was also founded very long ago in the 1990s as well. And they started off as a simple search engine, but without the websites, without all these internet native solutions, it couldn't take off. So it took decades for them to finally permeate the entire world. And now everybody has access and nobody can imagine a life without the internet. We see a similar trend happening in blockchain, and in fact, even faster than what was happening in the internet age. When Bitcoin was created in 2000, 2009. Uh, the first use case was only cryptocurrency. And as Prof. Carter mentioned, there are many challenges and limitations to that. But in the run-up to the 2018 hype cycle, many more companies started creating infrastructure such as stablecoins, such as Ethereum, which will then allow you to create a myriad of various applications, anything you can think of on this blockchain infrastructure. And naturally, that led to an inordinate hype cycle where everybody wanted to jump in and raise funds or like invest in blockchain companies. And therefore, there was a bubble that was created. But at the same time, that meant there was a huge concentration of talent and capital that has come into the blockchain industry. And in fact, LinkedIn has rated blockchain as the most sought after hard skill, I think, of this year, and was the fastest rising one of last year. So we are actually seeing right now the rapid takeoff of then the applications that are starting to take shape and starting to make sense in the real world use cases. And this is happening in about half the time of what it, or even less than that, of what it took the internet to take off. If I may illustrate this with an example, if we can go to the next page, Prof. Carter. One major example that has recently launched that I'm particularly excited about is Falcoin. Now, Falcoin looks into decentralizing files. Now, in order to look at this, let's go back to the very beginning. Initially, information was transmitted mainly through paper or some sort of like physical exchange. And when Microsoft came about, they digitized it and made it easily transferable and accessible with the Microsoft Office suite. So you can say that Microsoft fully disrupted the paper industry of like storing and exchanging files and information. Of course, there are many details there and nuances there, printing press and so on, and the radios and such. But simplified to say that Microsoft came in to disrupt this whole space. And then very quickly after that, Google came in to disrupt the space again with Google Cloud, with its now Google suite of services, which can then do everything on the cloud and make it collaborative and much more easily accessible. Now, what does the next generation of disruption look like? So we have already made all the front end and the services very accessible, but the back end, the data centers for provisioning of all the infrastructure is still very much dependent on what Google can provide. And in a way that also limits the capabilities of what these storage or like file or information exchange services can give you. So what Filecoin does using blockchain is to democratize or make it accessible or enable anyone to then become part of this like storage network where you can become part of a Google Cloud equivalent, where you can create your, prepare a few servers at home or at a particular place, or even offer up your own laptops with sufficient storage power to then be part of this like cloud network, and therefore be the back end of this information or file exchange network. Now, you may think this sounds really futuristic, but so far, just within a span of quite a few months, half a year or so, they have amassed more than 815 petabytes of data. To put that into perspective, there's more than 100 times of the entire Netflix archive and more than 2,500 times the entire Wikipedia. And this is spread throughout the entire world. You can see down there that 700, more than 700 miners, which are providing the storage space, many of them professional, across US, Europe, China, and Southeast Asia as well. So blockchain represents this kind of a new wave of disruption, whereby previously the tech giants kind of monopolize some of these spaces, but because you can have this very trusted record of how people can interact with each other or provide certain digital assets, this trusted record allows people to then interact, even though there is very little trust in the person, because all the rules are mandated by code. Should I hand it back to you, Dr. Prof. Carter?
Sure. What I love about this picture here, though, is it shows Microsoft, right? But even before we were getting into email, we had Microsoft Word and Excel on our desks. And I remember back then in the 90s looking at this, and Google, 1994, 1991 even was just, kind of in beginning to jump in place. And then as we come up here, we see a nice trend and an interesting trend, the disruptors being disrupted along the way. What should we take away from these past two slides that Shakai walked us through? Is that it's not instant, it's not overnight that these technologies come into play. It took 20 or so years for the internet to become very interesting and compelling. And it's taking about that amount of time for cloud and everything to come in. You remember Amazon was 2005 or so that they started. And now as we see blockchain coming into play, we see that very interesting. I like that chart you have, Shakai, of the market cap coming down, for the internet bubble crash, and then it coming back up. And now we're seeing in a faster pace, the market cap came up, crashed in terms of blockchain and all the cryptocurrencies. And now we're seeing it come back up. Shakai, what do you think? What is LongHash's view in terms of the landscape right now and some of the opportunities that you're seeing in addition to Filecoin?
Yes, for sure. So we see kind of like two major areas where the blockchain startups are playing. One area is where they apply it to more enterprise use cases, where you would typically use it for more efficiency. And that's where you can see a lot of these multinational companies trying to use blockchain for, say, supply chain or say provenance. And all of these make it much more efficient. Although there are also challenges and whether it makes sense or not. And there are many hurdles to be overcome to truly make it go to production. The other aspect is where blockchain startups build what we call blockchain native services such as Falcoin. So the design space for that is really vast. And I'm not sure whether I want to go into a lot of the detail. But the core principle behind it is that instead of everybody building their own siloed infrastructure where they have to rebuild all of the technical architecture, what blockchain and open source software allows you to do is essentially coordinate large groups of people, coordinate across different projects so that everyone can integrate into each other seamlessly without permission. I don't need to say sign this MOU and then create this API and then integrate with these various companies because we're all built on a blockchain. And if we're on the same blockchain or blockchains that can talk to each other, I can immediately tap into your digital assets or tap into your smart contracts. And with that, all the information and user flow can then be even more seamless. And I think that is the secret sauce that is making this ecosystem grow really quickly right now. Because I just need to build the components that I am good at that can provide value. I don't have to rebuild a full tech stack as with all the tech companies today have to do.
And that's a really key point that Shakai has mentioned, is that there's this great knowledge sharing and community that's available here in terms of jumping in and understanding blockchain. There's so much content you can go and read, learn, and more. And Shakai also earlier mentioned that in terms of jobs, one of the higher paying development jobs is doing blockchain development now as well. Shakai, can I get a blockchain development job? I'd love
In fact, yes, there are so many blockchain companies hiring today because the space is growing so quickly. And in fact, the people, the talent cannot keep up to the demand of like the jobs being created.
Well, I hope that we at NUS can contribute in some way to that as well in terms of building our talent here. I want to introduce Amber Tan. She is with the Smart Nation and the PMO's office. She helped to organize this event with us, and she's going to be helping to guide us with some of the questions that are coming in. Thanks for all the questions that are being asked here. Just a little bit of background on Amber. She worked at the NUS School of Public Policy, and I really enjoy the folks over there. And so we share that. And she also worked closely with NUS Scale, the continuing education arm of NUS. So, and now is with the PMO office, helping to get these type of events and this knowledge out there. And Amber's going to keep us honest. Anything that we that Shakai and I said that wasn't exactly clear. She's going to help us make sure to clarify it and provide more context and everything. So, Amber, welcome into the stage with us.
Thank you, Prof. Thanks, Shi Khai and Prof, for the very interesting session. I must say that I have actually learned quite a bit. So, I'll be the man in the street, the layman lens. So please keep the questions coming. We have currently 7 questions open. So probably we'll start with the first few questions by Dawn. So I realized that the questions were filled during the Prof Carter's presentation at the flow chart. So I'll presume that is referring to 2. So the 2 questions are, how is the transaction validated? And what happened if there's an error in the transaction? So probably this part, Prof. Carter would maybe want to weigh in. Yeah, I would believe that he was referring to the flow chart. Yeah.
Yes, I remember. And Shakai, I welcome you to jump in as well on the technical side. So there's different protocols. And so you have the Bitcoin, or typically blockchain associated with Bitcoin. You have Ethereum, and typically like you have other types of currencies and the related either digital ledger or blockchain type of system that's running underneath that. And below that are things like proof of stake, proof of work, etc. The ways that the protocols themselves work and gain consensus, or if they, and that's in the case that you gain consensus and you have a decentralized blockchain. You have a centralized blockchain where, for example, Ripple, they have almost like a master head, although there's miners all around, and they can, if they would want to, as a corporate and what have you, be able to come in and make adjustments if they felt necessary. So in terms of the error and validation, I want to first say that they're centralized and decentralized, and those 2 different models will go in and do validation and error changes very differently. The centralized model, you have a control that says, okay, I see there's an error. I can go in and make the adjustment because I have the permission that I need over this entire thing. The decentralized model is a bit more complex. If there's an error in the transaction, sometimes if you sent the money to the wrong wallet, I'm sorry, it's gone. It can be that serious. Shakai, you want to add something?
Yeah, sure. So actually on the transaction validation, actually there are kind of 2 levels to it as well. What Prof. Carter was talking about is at the blockchain level, which transactions to include in a block, and therefore kind of like validate them, like cement them into that block. Before you actually do that, in order to even initiate any transaction, you actually have to sign with a private key, which is a kind of the password equivalent of your blockchain address. And so that in itself actually cryptographically secures your transaction. So nobody else is actually able to forge the transaction in your name because of that encryption mechanism. And then it gets included in the block. So doubly secure. And then in terms of the error in the transaction, certainly if we use the decentralized networks, it is a challenge if you send it to the wrong address. I think that being said, there are protocols which are trying to overcome this challenge. For example, one of the technology partners we are working with called Algorand, they created Algorand standard assets, whereby upfront, when I'm about to create these assets, I can say, I only want these whitelisted addresses to be able to hold these assets. And if, for example, they're accidentally transferred to the wrong address, I can forcibly move them back as well. So even though it's decentralized, they can code in some of these rights or privileges to prevent some of these challenges.
Thank you so much. All right, so now probably we can actually move on to the next question. I will link the next two questions together. So is Singapore also issuing a digital currency? What are the pros and cons of a digital currency, and how ready is Singapore for mass adoption of blockchain? And what are the necessary conditions for this?
Great.
Is it too long? Yeah, okay, that's
okay,
fine, right?
Okay, no, it's good. There's a few things here. In order to do digital currency at a government level well, there's some infrastructure that needs to be put in place. You should have a way to do something called KYC, know your customer. And this way you know who's doing the transactions. You should have a way to, you need a strong internet infrastructure like good mobile, those types of physical infrastructures need to be there. You need to have a regulator, like the Monetary Authority of Singapore is, who's willing to let things be tried out, either in sandboxes or to place regulation at the right timing as well, or to issue certain licenses that'll help companies know that they're on safe footing and safe grounding. Singapore is well positioned in terms of, is it ready for digital currencies, because of those several good building blocks that are in place. Good internet infrastructure. We have the MyInfo system, which GovTech rolled out. It allows you to do, go in and instantly open a bank account, with a few clicks. And because of that, they know who it is. And so you have a very good infrastructure to kick off digital currency with. Shakai, I don't want to take up everything. You want to add in here as well?
Sure thing. Actually, I'd like to point to an example. So one of the regulated Singapore fintech companies called XFers, XFERS, actually they have already issued kind of a digital currency equivalent of the Singapore dollar. And they are actually running it on the Zilliqa blockchain, which is a Singapore-based blockchain company. And because they have all these KYC steps in place, they can also be compliant with identification and also the travel rule to prevent AML. So definitely, I think identity, like Prof. Carter said, is one of the most central components to make this happen. And if I may add a little bit about the pros, what I'm really excited about is in the future, where a digital currency becomes truly programmable. So today, if the government wants to, say, implement certain tax changes, or they want to customize certain tax standards for certain groups, for certain goods, or they want to disburse funds to certain disadvantaged groups through subsidies, tax rebates, all of this, it's actually quite complex to execute. If we have a central bank digital currency, all of this can be just programmed into the currency, tweaked very quickly and rapidly iterated, and completely transparent, so everybody can see it happening in real time, or at least the government, the regulators, and the people who are executing it can do so. And that makes the whole financial ecosystem much more transparent, much more efficient, and perhaps personalized as well.
That's right. And to add on, you do also have to have good knowledge in terms of people who can do programming, development, people that can take the idea that Shakai just talked about, automating certain activities and so forth. And there are so many more jobs and positions that are necessary, because as we do it well here in Singapore, we'll be able to export that knowledge and capability. Right, you can sit right here and set up a blockchain in Brazil, set up the similar type of system in Venezuela, just sitting right here in Singapore. Because in this knowledge economy, you no longer even need a storefront. You can just be right in your place in order to control and develop businesses and more. And so the other pro of digital currency is that you're able to easily facilitate the transfer of goods and services for a fund anywhere in the world at any time. So this is the right technology for today's new economy, the knowledge economy.
Thank you so much. Okay, so the next question is also a little related. So thanks for sharing a little bit about the Singapore scene. So how does Singapore compare to the rest of the world in terms of the development, in terms of blockchain or cryptocurrency?
Shakai?
Okay, I'll take this one. I would say Singapore is definitely one of the global leaders in terms of blockchain and digital asset innovation. Even back in the 2018 hype cycle, so many companies decided to come to Singapore because Singapore was willing to be open to the idea that you can have a new digital asset class, and they're willing to let people experiment. And they only look at you, okay, if you are truly doing activities that are like clearly like behaving like securities, then they start looking into it. Or you're clearly doing things that are money laundering, then they will look into it. But if you want to just innovate, there are plenty of avenues to do so. There's the sandbox as well if you want to engage that. And therefore we saw a flood of blockchain companies coming to Singapore, including today. And right now, in fact, the Payment Services Act is in the middle of bringing digital assets into the truly regulated space. And while the digital asset companies are kind of like facing challenges to obtain the necessary licenses to regulate it, but this definitely puts Singapore at the forefront of bringing this innovation to like the legitimate space, to the regulated space.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is like, let's say if it's Amber, the layman, the man in the street who wants to actually approach in Singapore. So where do we start?
Well, I would say come over to NUS, at least FinTech Lab. Come hear about it, see what blockchain is like, understand a bit. Certainly join some of the events that LongHash has as well, and hear about, again, what the companies are doing, meet some of the people that are working in those companies, get a sense first, get a feeling of what's out there in the first instance. And Singapore is convenient for that, right? It's now a lot of things are on Zoom, and even when it wasn't, it was easy just to drive across town or take a MRT across town as well. So these are good ways to get started, in my view.
Yeah, I agree. There's no kind of like one textbook, just as, if you want to learn about what is the internet and how do you use it, there's no kind of one place to do it. So certainly NUS is fantastic. LongHash, we hold quite a few meetups as well. And in Singapore, plenty of institutions in the universities also actually have meetup groups. There are plenty of community-led meetup groups as well about blockchain. And nowadays in COVID, the conferences on blockchain are purely global and digital. So feel free to search all of these up. The YouTube videos and the conferences are fantastic resources.
That's right. And there's also Poly FinTech 100. The Polytechnics are jumping out all over this too. There's lots of areas to go in, and there's just not enough people. So I saw David ask this question. We need more people in this space fast. Plenty of space. We also have our FinTech SG program. It's a 2.5 months program where you can come in, you learn about why FinTech, front end and back end development, and then go to deployment, which is to the cloud and also making smart contracts as well. And so you come out of that at least being able to program in Solidity, but having a full perspective of what it's all about as well. So I can't help but share that as well.
Okay, thank you. So the next question we have is, how does Falcoin make money? Interesting question. So maybe Shakai can help to answer that question.
Sure thing. So one important thing to keep in mind is that Falcoin is not a company. Similar to, in a similar vein as like say Bitcoin, there's no company, no CEO that's running it. It's just code that is published on a whole bunch of computers because the computers agree to run the same version of the code. So it's run by consensus because everybody agrees to operate by the same rules, and those rules are governed by code. And so for Falcoin as well, there's no company to kind of like generate profits from this. What they wrote is code that will allow people to exchange storage space in what we call a programmable way or trustless way, in the sense that you don't need to trust a person. You just need to know that the code helps you execute it in the way they expect it to. So in this sense, the miners, if you wish to provide storage space, then you can do so. And then you can certify or prove that you have provided the storage space by running the Filecoin code. And therefore, when people actually use that storage space, then they will pay you to do that. And all of that happens on the blockchain. I hope that is clear enough.
Thank you. There is a technical question that comes in. They're saying that blockchain are immutable, meaning that if I make an error, you can only create a new block to correct the block. The error block will remain in the blockchain. So maybe either Prof or Shikai can help to answer this question.
I can go first. Okay, sure. So yes, to create a new block to correct a block, in the industry we call that a fork, because typically in the blockchain, when you actually form this chain, And you cannot go back to change the previous block. In order to do that, you actually have to decrypt the whole block and reverse all the transactions. So that's virtually impossible. In fact, one of the most famous analogies by the Blockchain Research Institute called it it's as if you made the chicken into a nugget and you're trying to unscramble the nugget back into the chicken. This is almost impossible. So it is true. If there is an error, which has happened in the past before, not really an error, but let's say it was exploited in a certain way that everybody agrees should not be the way it is to be used, then all the community, the people who run the blockchain, the computers which are running the code, what we call the nodes, can agree to then say, I'm not going to recognize that from this point onwards, this block onwards, I'm going to, from this point onwards, go with a different chain, a different blockchain, which stems from like an older version. So that's what we call a fork, and that necessarily corrects the kind of like the error, if you wish.
Exactly. And there have been also errors in contracts. So those are programs that when certain conditions are met, it'll decide if it wants to move a digital asset from one owner to another. And there's been errors in the contracts where the digital asset moves to a null value, to the wrong wallet. Maybe you can set the wallet to someone else's, or it just even locks up and doesn't allow anything to move. And so the programming error that a programmer makes could also cause incorrect transactions too. And the immutability part makes it impossible to get it back out. So yes, millions in various cryptocurrencies have been lost through these types of errors in contracts.
Yeah, perhaps at this point, it is good to point out, even more so, because blockchains are run on code instead of like trusting people and process. So it's even more important to make sure that the code itself is checked and double checked, triple checked, and tested, simulated. So that's why entire industries have sprung out, sub-industries called smart contract auditing, where they actually read through all the code, or like they run it through simulations to make sure it does what it's supposed to do and doesn't do anything it's not supposed to do. And there are also simulation companies that actually run through various kind of like forms of attacks and exploits to try to find ways to attack these smart contracts. So certainly this is an important area that you have pointed out, and plenty of opportunities for you to innovate in this space as well.
Exactly. And it just goes to show this is a job that didn't exist a few years ago. You know, smart contract auditor. It doesn't, now it's here.
Yeah. Okay, so now we'll move on to the last question of today's webinar. I understand there are more questions coming in, but not to worry. We have actually shared the LinkedIn profile of Carter and Shi Khai in the chat itself, so please feel free to reach out to them. Okay, so the last question, how to avoid crypto or ICO scams? Any advice from the experts?
Ask
Prof,
lots of questions. Go ahead, Shakai. I mean, I was going to only just say, you know, understand who's behind the business, right? What if it's like doing business or any type of investment? You always want to ask who's behind this, what's their game plan, how does it work, and the most important thing, don't, you know, if it's, oh wow, it's going up, it's doubling, you know, still don't rush because it's doubling, but it could half. So be careful.
Yeah, absolutely. The main thing to keep in mind is if it's too good to be true, it probably is fake. So the best way, of course, I mean, the ultimate way is that you're able to then read the code of what they have built, and you can actually see what it's supposed to do. But if they haven't even built anything and it's just an idea, a white paper, then I would be very careful. Typically, one easy way to gain some trust is to check whether some reputable institutions have endorsed some of these companies. So, for example, have they gone through an accelerator program that's backed by the Singapore government, for example, that we do incredible due diligence? Have they been backed by certain traditional VCs that actually do a lot of due diligence? Or have they been kind of like used by plenty of the reputable projects in the blockchain space if you're already familiar within the space? But yes, always, be careful and do your own research.
Yep. Thank you so much.
I'd
So
like
once again,
I'd like to wrap up with one.
oh, sure, please go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. So listen, most importantly, we can make a difference together. My wife and I are eternally grateful for the folks, the nets and others that enabled QR codes to get out there, and all the volunteers and others that are going around to the hawker centers sharing about digital literacy and more, which enables my father-in-law here to continue to run his business. And so we are also having a FinTech literacy and financial literacy push. If you're interested in volunteering, here's a QR code here, and keep in touch with us. We look forward to seeing you at the Singapore FinTech Festival, I hope, and especially the Talent Pavilion, where you'll get to hear more about things like this and what's the possibilities out there and where you can go further. And of course, connect with other great companies like the ones that LongHash Ventures is supporting. Thanks.
Can I add as well?
Participate. What would you say, Shakai? Go ahead.
If I may add as well. So
Yeah.
if all of this interests you, and if you wish to start a blockchain company or a startup, or perhaps join a certain startup or support, or just find out more, please feel free to get in touch with me. We always love to support up and coming entrepreneurs. It's never too late. This is such an exciting and truly disruptive space, and welcome you to join us.
Thank you, Prof. and Shi Khai, for the sharing today. I believe myself, I've learned so much about blockchain, and I'm sure that you guys have shared the same sentiments. So what happened is that we will be sending a post-event survey. Please do help us to build it up so that we can actually improve on our program. So once again, thanks for joining us today, and have a great day ahead. Thank you, everybody.